Welcome to True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat and every scar tells a truth. Thank you for watching True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And tell us in the comments, do you believe redemption still exists in a world like this? The winter wind swept across the rugged plains like a wandering spirit, carrying with it the taste of dust, snow, and memories that refused to die. Within that vast emptiness rode a lone cowboy named Elias Ward, a man shaped by the plains the way a river shapes stone, slowly, unrelentingly, and without mercy. Years of drifting from town to town had left him both hardened and hollow, a man without roots, without warmth, and without anything that could be called a home. He had once known a version of himself who laughed easily, who believed in the simple goodness of the world, who thought the frontier was a place that rewarded hard work and honest hearts. But frontier life was a cruel teacher. It took from him everything he had once trusted, leaving behind a man who lived on instinct and guarded silence. The ache inside him had long ago settled into something familiar, something that kept him riding farther than he ever needed to. That morning he rode west, guiding his tired horse through a stretch of land marked by weathered mesas and quiet ravines. Snow clung to the edges of the rocks, and the sky bore the pale color of early dawn. A cold calmness hung in the air, broken only by the steady beat of hoof against frozen ground. Elias carried no plans for the day beyond finding a place to rest. He sought no company, no conversation, and certainly no trouble. But in the Wild West, trouble came uninvited, and destiny often chose moments when the world was at its quietest. He came upon the remnants of a settlement that had once belonged to a small band of Apache. The few structures still standing were scorched, half buried under drifting snow, and surrounded by silence so heavy it seemed sacred. Spirals of smoke rose faintly from a dying fire near the largest hut, signifying that someone still lingered among the ruins. Elias slowed his horse, scanning the area with the weary caution of a man who'd seen too many ambushes and too many unexpected endings. Among the broken shapes of what had once been a thriving home, he noticed footprints, two sets, one belonging to a child, light and quick, and another heavier, pacing in patterns that betrayed worry and fatigue. The small prints ended abruptly at the river bank, where jagged ice traced the shore like broken glass. The river flowed faster than it should have in winter, as though something deep beneath the water churned the current with restless force. Elias dismounted and approached the remains of the fire. What he found there stilled even his seasoned breath. An Apache woman knelt beside the fading flames, her shoulders wrapped in a tattered blanket, her dark hair heavy with melting frost. Her posture told a story of exhaustion, of cold that had seeped into bone, and of grief so fresh it bled into the air around her. Beside her sat an empty cradle board, its surface worn from years of use, but its occupant nowhere in sight. Elias observed in silence. He knew loss when he saw it. He felt it like a phantom pain in his own chest. The woman's eyes, though fixed on the fire, were distant and hollow, as if searching for something she feared she might never find. The settlement around her offered clues, tracks of raiders in the dirt, signs of struggle, belongings scattered as though ripped from hurried hands. It was the aftermath of violence, the kind that came swiftly and left no survivors except the unlucky few. The woman's presence among the ruins suggested she had been left behind or had escaped during the chaos. Elias sensed strength in her posture despite the grief weighing upon her. Apache women were known for their resilience, their ability to endure hardship with a quiet ferocity that rivaled the land itself. Yet even the strongest spirit could be pushed to the edge, especially when a child was involved. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest scent of smoke from something far older than the settlement's fire. Smoke mixed with the smell of gunpowder and burnt skin. Raiders had been near recently, perhaps still close. The thought tightened Elias's grip on the reins. He rarely involved himself in other people's battles. The frontier had taught him the danger of caring, the way empathy could become a weapon used against you. But he also knew that no one should face the wilderness alone, especially not a woman who had just seen her world torn apart. He surveyed the area, tracing the direction the raiders might have traveled. The truth was grim. If they had taken the child, the trail would already be cold. Raiders moved quickly, and winter storms erased tracks with merciless efficiency. Still, something compelled him to stay. Perhaps an echo of who he used to be. Perhaps a flicker of humanity he thought long extinguished. Or perhaps it was the way the woman sat unmoving beside the fire, as though her spirit teetered on the edge of surrender. The plains stretched endlessly behind him, offering escape if he wished to take it. Yet Elias found his boots sinking deeper into the snow instead of turning back toward his horse. The woman had endured loss great enough to hollow out the heart, and in that hollowing, Elias recognized a reflection of himself. For years he had believed his own pain had no equal, but here before him stood someone whose suffering resonated like a distant but familiar melody. The woman lifted her head slowly, sensing his presence. Her eyes met his, two dark, exhausted pools carrying storms of their own. Elias felt something shift inside him, a quiet recognition that two broken souls had crossed paths in a moment shaped by fate. If he walked away now, he knew the guilt would follow him like a shadow he could never outrun. The frontier offered few opportunities for redemption. Perhaps this was the closest thing he would ever find. A cold gust swept the settlement, extinguishing what little warmth remained in the fire. The woman pulled the blanket tighter around herself, bracing against the bite of the wind. Elias knew the storm rolling over the horizon would grow worse before nightfall. Leaving her here meant certain death, not from raiders, not from sorrow, but from the cold itself. The land was unforgiving, and winter cared nothing for human fragility. He took a step forward, feeling the weight of responsibility settle upon him like an old coat he thought he had shed years ago. His life had been a long journey of running from memories, from past mistakes, from the pieces of himself he didn't wish to confront. But something about this moment anchored him in place. The woman, though silent, seemed to carry a question in her gaze, a question formed by loss, mistrust, and the knowledge that men on the frontier often sought only what they could take. Elias understood the suspicion in her eyes. He had seen the cruelty of men, had witnessed the way some treated Apache women as objects to claim rather than people deserving dignity. The frontier was filled with stories of exploitation, of suffering inflicted upon those who had already endured too much. The woman's wariness was justified, carved into her heart by a lifetime of betrayal. As the sky darkened with incoming snow, Elias realized the chapter of his life spent wandering might finally be meeting its end. Whether he wished it or not, he was now entwined in a story larger than himself, a story born of heartbreak, survival, and the faintest spark of hope flickering beneath winter's icy grip. The woman stood, trembling from the cold but holding herself with quiet strength. Elias felt the land settle into silence between them, the kind of silence that invites choices that could change the course of lives. And in that silence, the question lingering in her gaze was one he knew he could not ignore. Thus, as the storm gathered on the horizon, their fates intertwined, leading them toward a journey neither of them had expected. The storm advanced like a slow-moving beast, its gray shrouds stretching across the plains as though trying to swallow the broken settlement whole. Elias stood in the half-light, feeling the cold tighten around him, while the Apache woman faced the wind with the stoic stillness of someone who had already braved storms far worse than the one on the horizon. Her expression held an ache carved deep by grief, yet beneath the sorrow lay an iron strength, the kind born from hardship rather than choice. Elias watched as snow began to drift around her, clinging to her hair and blanket like pale fingerprints from the sky. She moved with deliberate slowness, picking up the cradle board and brushing the soot from its surface with trembling hands. The emptiness of the cradle told a story no words could capture, a story about a child whose laughter had once filled this land, a child whose absence had torn a wound so profound the world itself seemed to echo with it. Though Elias had witnessed loss many times before, something about her resilience struck him. The woman's grief was not loud or desperate, it was a quiet storm, one that churned inward. She held herself together through sheer will, as though refusing to let sorrow steal what remained of her dignity. The settlement around her had burned, but she had not. She stood rooted to the earth like a solitary tree that had survived a wildfire, charred but still alive. Snow thickened as the minutes passed, swirling around the charred huts and burying what remained of the raiders' tracks. The storm seemed intent on erasing the past, yet Elias suspected the woman would not allow her child's trail to disappear so easily. There was a determination in her stance, a refusal to surrender. Even grief could not extinguish the fierce love of a mother, especially an Apache mother raised on stories of courage and resilience. Elias scanned the horizon once more, gauging the direction the raiders might have taken, but the land was already disappearing beneath a white haze. The storm's arrival was sudden and unforgiving, forcing the plains into a tomb-like stillness. He knew that if they remained here, the cold would soon overtake them. The wind carried a bitterness that cut through layers of clothing, sinking its claws into bone and spirit alike. The settlement offered no shelter, no warmth, nothing but ruins haunted by the memories of what had been lost. Still, the woman lingered. Her fingers traced the edges of the cradle board, her eyes fixed on the fire's last embers. The orange glow flickered weakly, casting shadows across her face that resembled the faint outlines of a life that had been ripped away too soon. Elias recognized something in her hesitation, an unwillingness to leave the last place where she had seen her child, an unspoken promise to return, even if the land refused to remember. The rawness of her pain pressed upon Elias, stirring memories he had buried long ago. He remembered a time when he too had lost someone dear, a moment when the world had shattered in silence, leaving behind a hollow space no amount of wandering could fill. For years he had drifted, trying to outrun the ache, convincing himself that attachments were nothing more than traps set by fate. But the sight of the woman, standing amidst ashes with her heart laid open to the cold, reminded him that loss was a universal language, spoken by the broken and understood by those who had suffered enough to recognize its weight. The snow thickened further, swirling in frantic spirals. The air grew heavy, muffling every sound except the distant rumble of thunder hidden within the storm. The woman's blanket, already worn and thin, offered little protection from the cold. Her shivering grew more pronounced, though she made no effort to move or shield herself. Elias realized she had surrendered to exhaustion long before he had arrived, and the only thing keeping her upright now was sheer determination not to fall before the spirits of her ancestors. He stepped back toward his horse, the animal pawing anxiously at the frozen ground. The storm unsettled it, making its breath plume in sharp, rapid bursts. Elias understood the urgency of leaving, yet he also understood the weight of abandonment. The woman had survived raiders, fire, and unimaginable loss. Leaving her here would be a cruelty he could not live with, even if she mistrusted him, even if she feared his intentions. The sky darkened to a near twilight tone as the storm swallowed the sun. Snowflakes grew heavier, swirling in frantic, ghost-like patterns. Elias tightened his coat, feeling the cold settle deeper into his limbs. He approached the woman again, watching as she lifted her head at the faint sound of his footsteps. Her gaze locked onto him, wary but unbroken. She clutched the cradle board to her chest, as though holding on to the last thread, tying her to a child stolen by merciless hands. Elias understood then that the woman's strength came not only from survival, but from the internal battle she fought every moment, between the grief urging her to collapse and the resolve commanding her to stand. She had been left widowed by raiders who had taken her husband seasons ago. Now the same cruelty had torn away her last living connection to him, their child. Her entire world had been reduced to ashes within a single day, and the land beneath her feet held the remnants of a life that had been stripped away without mercy. The storm intensified, forcing Elias to make a choice he could not delay any longer. He knew the woman would not willingly abandon this place, but he also knew she would not survive if she stayed. The frontier respected strength, but it demanded practicality. The wind carried a warning, and the snow spoke its brutal truth. Survival required movement, not mourning. He looked toward the remains of the settlement one last time, the charred huts, the scattered belongings, the smoke rising like the last breath of a dying soul. The land itself seemed to weep in silence. Elias felt the air tightening around them, urging action. There was no time to search for tracks now. Winter had drawn its curtain across the plains, and the storm's ferocity promised to erase every clue before dawn. The woman finally lifted her eyes from the cradleboard, her face set with a quiet resolve born from years of enduring hardship. She turned toward the distant mountains rising beyond the plains, their snowy peaks watching over the land like ancient guardians. Elias sensed that her heart had already set a direction, even if her body lacked the strength to follow it. The storm howled around them, urging them forward. Elias knew their journey would not be easy. They faced more than cold. They faced raiders, unknown terrain, and the raw edges of grief. Yet the path ahead was the only path left. Turning back was impossible, staying was fatal, and giving up was something neither of them could bear, even if their hearts were heavy with wounds that had yet to stop bleeding. The wind surged, scattering snow across the ruins like a final farewell. And so, with the storm closing in and the land growing colder by the second, their uncertain journey began, not as allies, not yet as companions, but as two broken souls bound by the same unforgiving land, and by losses that mirrored each other in their silent ache. The frontier awaited them, along with truths neither was ready to face. The storm swallowed the plains with a merciless hunger, blanketing the world in white and burying the ruins of the Apache settlement beneath its icy shroud. Elias and the widowed Apache woman moved through the swirling snow with the slow determination of travelers who understood that survival demanded each step be chosen with care. The woman clutched the cradleboard close to her chest, as though holding the last fragile piece of her shattered world. Elias guided his horse beside her, letting the animal's instincts find steadier ground than human senses could, in such bitter cold. The land seemed to shrink beneath the storm's wrath. Hills, mesas, and distant ridges, all landmarks Elias once relied upon, were reduced to ghostly outlines barely visible through the swirling snow. Their world had become a narrow path, carved by instinct rather than sight. The wind lashed at them, each gust sharper than a blade. Snowflakes stung their skin like needles, and the cold gnawed at muscle and bone, until moving forward felt like lifting mountains with raw hands. Yet they pressed on. The woman's resilience became a silent force that guided their pace. Despite her exhaustion, her steps remained steady, carried by a determination that surpassed physical strength. Loss had hollowed her heart, but it had not broken her will. Elias watched her closely, ready to step in should her body falter, though he sensed she would refuse help unless absolutely necessary. Pride lived deeply within her. Apache pride forged by generations who had survived hardship, not by bending, but by standing unshaken. For hours they traveled through the storm, their only companions the howling wind and the endless white that consumed the horizon. Elias knew they needed shelter soon, but the plains before them offered no promise of refuge. Winter had stripped the land bare, leaving behind only skeletal trees and dry shrubs half buried under the accumulating snow. The frontier was a land of beauty in gentler seasons, but in winter it became an unforgiving judge that allowed only the strongest to endure. As the storm began to settle into a slower, oppressive rhythm, they finally reached a shallow ravine where the cliffs shielded them from the harshest winds. The drop into the ravine was steep but manageable, and Elias led the horse carefully down the slope while the woman followed, her steps careful yet unwavering. Within the natural shelter, the wind softened, allowing some warmth to return to their limbs. The ravine stretched ahead like a narrow corridor carved by time and weather. Its walls bore the marks of ancient floods and shifting earth, creating pockets of shadow where sparse vegetation clung to life. Elias scanned the rocky edges, recognizing signs that small animals had sought shelter here earlier. The presence of wildlife meant the ravine offered at least temporary reprieve from the storm. They found a ledge shielded by an overhanging rock formation, and Elias guided the horse beneath it, allowing the weary animal to finally rest. The Apache woman lowered herself beside the cradleboard, her exhaustion settling over her like a second blanket. Her breathing deepened, though her eyes never fully softened. Grief kept her mind alert, even when her body longed for sleep. The storm outside roared on, sending occasional gusts swirling into the ravine. Elias gathered dry twigs from the sheltered corners and sparked a small fire. Its glow illuminated the woman's face, revealing lines of fatigue, determination, and a sorrow far too heavy for someone so young. She rested the cradle board on her lap, tracing its carved patterns with trembling fingers. Those carvings told stories, stories of protection, ancestry, and the sacred bond between mother and child. Now those patterns held the weight of absence. Elias allowed her the silence she needed. The fire crackled softly, fighting back the cold with modest warmth. The ravine floor trembled slightly as the storm's force pressed against the world above. The land felt alive, as though listening to their grief and struggles with the solemn dignity of an ancient guardian. When the woman finally closed her eyes, sleep claimed her in fragments. Her breaths grew shallow but steady, and her fingers never loosened their grip on the cradle board. Elias watched over her, understanding that even in rest, she carried the unbearable heaviness of a heart torn apart. The pain of losing a child was a wound that time did not heal. It became part of the soul, shaping every step that followed. Elias remained awake long into the night. The storm's faint whispers echoed like distant cries, stirring memories he'd buried beneath years of wandering. He recalled a life he had once tried to build, a promise he had made but could not keep, a woman whose smile had been the last warm memory before fate had taken her away forever. He had believed he deserved no second chance at companionship or belonging. But now, watching the Apache woman struggle to survive the weight of her grief, he felt a stirring inside him, a faint, unfamiliar urge to protect something more than himself. The storm eventually softened into a gentle snowfall. Hours passed before dawn painted the sky with muted hues, and the ravine filled with the soft glow of morning light. The Apache woman stirred, her eyes opening slowly as she pulled herself back into the waking world. Fatigue clung to her features, but something else flickered behind her gaze, resolve sharpened by the quiet strength of ancestors who had endured storms far worse than this one. With daylight came clarity. The snow outside the ravine had settled enough to reveal faint impressions, tracks half buried but still readable. Elias examined them closely. These were not the prints of wild animals nor the heavy marks of his own horse. They belonged to raiders traveling with haste. The tracks cut across the plains, heading toward the distant foothills where cliffs formed natural hiding places for those who preyed on the helpless. The Apache woman stepped beside him, her gaze following the direction of the tracks. Though silent, her posture carried determination that spoke louder than words ever could. She had lost her home, her husband, and now her child. But she had not lost the fire that burned within her. That flame would guide her steps until she reached the end of the trail, whatever that end might be. Elias understood that their journey had only just begun. He realized now that he was not simply escorting a grieving mother through the wilderness. He was walking beside someone who possessed a strength capable of reshaping both their lives. The path ahead promised danger, raiders, cliffs, harsh terrain, and the relentless weight of uncertainty. Yet turning back was not an option. The trail of the taken stretched forward, and they would follow it until there was nothing left totally except truth. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint scent of smoke from somewhere beyond the foothills. It was the unmistakable sign of human presence, raiders' camps, or worse. Whatever waited ahead, it demanded courage greater than either of them had yet shown. The Apache woman clutched the cradle board once more, her fingers tightening around its edges as though drawing strength from it. Elias prepared the horse, steeling himself for the journey beyond the ravine. Their partnership had begun in silence and tragedy. What awaited them now would test the limits of their endurance, their courage, and the guarded remnants of their hearts. As the sun rose, casting long shadows over the snow-covered plains, they stepped out of the ravine and back into the harsh, unforgiving world, ready to chase the fading trail that might lead them to the child, or into the jaws of danger. The morning sun struggled through a sky still heavy with the remnants of the storm, casting pale light across the snow-covered plains. Elias and the widowed Apache woman moved steadily along the faint tracks left by the raiders, their shadows stretching long behind them as the wind carried a bitter edge. The path before them wound toward the foothills, where jagged rocks and shadowed cliffs created a natural maze. It was a place raiders favored, hidden enough to vanish into, yet close enough to isolated trade routes for easy ambushes. Each step they took brought a greater stillness, the kind that clung to the land like a warning. The frontier had a way of becoming silent when danger lurked nearby. Even the horse sensed it, lifting its head often, its ears turning toward distant echoes only animals could catch. The Apache woman walked with her usual quiet strength, her movements purposeful despite exhaustion gnawing at the edges of her endurance. Hours passed under the slow rise of the sun, and the land around them changed gradually from open plains to rugged terrain. Boulders protruded from the earth like the bones of some ancient beast, and the ground sloped upward in winding paths. Elias kept his attention fixed on the tracks. They were becoming clearer now, more defined as the land protected them from the storm's erasing touch. The raiders had traveled with heavy steps, dragging something or someone behind them. The sight of the deep furrow cut into the snow tightened Elias's chest with grim certainty. The Apache woman saw it too. Her hands tightened around the cradleboard, her shoulders stiffening with renewed resolve. She did not need words to convey what the tracks meant. The trail was unmistakably that of captors moving with haste, burdened by a small, struggling weight. Her child had been taken this way. Whether alive or not, the woman's heart refused to give in to despair. As they moved deeper into the foothills, the wind quieted, replaced by the echoing cries of distant birds circling high above the cliffs. The air grew heavier, carrying the faint smell of smoke and old fire pits. Elias paused, scanning the rocky formations for signs of movement. The raiders were nearby, he could feel it. He had tracked enough outlaws in his past to know the subtle shifts in the land when men hid within it. The Apache woman knelt beside the trail, examining a small piece of cloth caught on a thorny bush. It was torn, smeared with dirt and ash, but its pattern bore unmistakable Apache designs. Her breath trembled, though she held herself with the same austere strength she had shown since the attack. She tucked the cloth carefully into the cradleboard straps, treating it like a final message from her child left behind in desperation. They continued their ascent, following the winding path between towering cliffs. The shadows stretched like long, dark fingers across the snow, creating an endless play of light and darkness that made it difficult to separate shapes from illusions. The land felt alive with quiet tension, as if every stone concealed a threat and every echo carried a warning. By midday they reached a narrow passage where two rock walls rose sharply on either side, forming a natural corridor that invited both shelter and danger. Elias approached cautiously, studying the ground for fresh signs. The horse hesitated, shaking its head and pawing at the earth. Something in the animal's instincts warned of hidden presence. Elias proceeded alone at first, moving with the silent caution of someone well-versed in tracking hostile men. The Apache woman followed steps behind him, her movements soundless, her senses heightened by the knowledge that her child might be trapped somewhere beyond these rocks. As they emerged from the passage, the landscape opened into a small basin where sparse clusters of pines clung to the frozen ground. Smoke curled faintly from within the trees, rising in thin streams toward the sky. The scent of burnt wood and cooked meat drifted on the wind, clear evidence of a camp not far away. The Apache woman's posture shifted. Though her grief weighed heavily upon her, there was a fierce stillness in her expression, a quiet readiness born from a lifetime of defending her own. Elias knew she was preparing for whatever truth lay ahead, whether it brought rescue or devastation. The land held its breath around them, waiting for the moment the two travelers would confront what fate had placed on their path. They moved closer, skirting the rocks to avoid open ground. The basin's natural shape muffled sound, making every step feel amplified despite their caution. From behind a boulder, Elias caught the sight of figures moving through the camp, men dressed in mismatched clothing from raids across the frontier, their weapons leaning against tree trunks, their horses tied loosely nearby. The raiders lounged with the careless ease of men who believed themselves hidden from justice. The Apache woman's gaze scanned the camp, searching for any sign of the child. Elias followed her line of sight, and after a moment he saw it too, a small structure crafted from hides and branches, placed beside the raiders' supplies. Its purpose was unmistakable. It was where they kept captives. The realization carved a cold line through Elias's chest, deepening the urgency already burning within him. Before they could plan their approach, A sound rose unexpectedly from behind a cluster of rocks. It was soft yet distinct, the quiet crack of a branch breaking under a cautious foot. Elias tensed. The Apache woman froze. Both instinctively understood the meaning of such a sound. They were not the only ones tracking the raiders, and whatever presence lingered nearby was close enough to threaten or reveal them. Elias shifted his weight silently, positioning himself between the unseen presence and the Apache woman. The forest remained still, the snow untouched except for animal tracks and wind-blown debris. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of their own breathing and the muted crackle of distant fires. The Apache woman's gaze swept the shadows, her heartbeat steady despite the danger. A subtle rustle came again from the rocks, closer this time, carrying the faint shift of someone deliberately moving into position. Whoever stood hidden was skilled, avoiding open sight while approaching with quiet precision. Elias recognized the method as one used by hunters or scouts, those trained to move like ghosts across rugged land. The Apache woman sensed the same, her grip tightening on the cradle board. In this unforgiving world, friends were rare, enemies abundant, and strangers unpredictable. The unknown watcher could be another victim searching for their stolen kin, a rival band waiting to strike, or a scout for the raiders preparing to return to camp. The wind stilled, leaving an unnerving silence that stretched across the basin. The unseen figure remained hidden, and the tension grew to a sharp, fragile point. Elias and the Apache woman stood poised between danger and discovery, their presence precariously balanced on the edge of something that could change the entire course of their journey. The land held its breath once more. The moment before truths revealed themselves was always the quietest. The stillness that followed the rustling sound pressed down upon the basin with an almost unnatural weight, as though the land itself were bracing for the revelation of whoever crept among the rocks. Elias remained motionless, his body angled protectively toward the Apache woman, ready to intercept whatever danger emerged. The woman's heartbeat did not betray fear. Instead, her stance conveyed the hardened vigilance of someone whose life had been shaped by loss, survival, and the knowledge that every shadow held the potential for harm. For a moment the world seemed suspended, caught between the quiet of anticipation and the certainty of looming danger. A faint shift of snow came again, this time from a different angle, and Elias realized with growing unease that the unseen figure was circling them. Whether intentionally or merely tracking the same trail, the presence showed a level of stealth that only seasoned hunters possessed. The Apache woman sensed it too, her posture sharpening into readiness. Then, from behind a jagged rock formation near the basin's edge, a figure finally appeared, cautiously, silently, as though aware that even the slightest misstep could spark violence. Cloaked in rough hides and carrying the weathered look of someone who had spent years surviving on the harsher edges of the frontier, the stranger emerged from shadow with the measured confidence of a scout skilled in traversing dangerous land. Elias and the Apache woman did not move. Neither did the stranger. The three stood in a triangle of mutual caution, each studying the other with wordless calculation. The stranger's gaze drifted not toward Elias, but toward the Apache woman and the cradle board she clutched. Recognition flickered in his eyes. Recognition not of individuals, but of suffering he seemed to understand all too well. His face carried the look of one who had seen the cruelty of raiders and the horror that followed in their wake. The Apache woman watched him closely, her grief-sharpened instincts assessing whether the newcomer posed threat or shared purpose. The stranger's posture lacked aggression. Instead, he lowered his head in a gesture that hinted at respect or shared mourning. Without speaking, he glanced toward the raider camp hidden among the trees ahead, then back toward her. It was evident he had come following the same trail, drawn by wounds similar to her own. Before Elias or the woman could judge the full intention of this unexpected ally or rival, a distant shout echoed from the camp. Though muffled by pines and snow, the urgency in the shout sent a ripple of tension through the basin. The raiders were becoming active. The men who lounged lazily moments before now stirred with alarm, signaling that they had sensed something in the atmosphere, A disturbance, a presence, or perhaps the subtle shift in the wind that carried unfamiliar scents toward them. The stranger stiffened. Elias narrowed his attention toward the camp. The Apache woman gripped the cradleboard with trembling determination, her breathing shallow but controlled. She had traveled too far, endured too much, to let fear take root now. The shout from the camp grew louder as several raiders emerged into view, restless and scanning the forest's edge. The time for caution was dissolving quickly. The stranger motioned silently toward a higher vantage point in the rocks, urging the two travelers upward. His movements carried urgency, and though Elias remained wary, he understood the necessity of gaining higher ground before the raiders' search widened. The Apache woman followed without hesitation, driven by the fierce instinct of a mother searching for her stolen child. Together they climbed the rocky slope, finding cover behind a natural ledge that overlooked the raider camp. From here, the scene below unfolded with clarity. The raiders moved with increasing agitation, scanning the surrounding area, their hands reaching instinctively for weapons. One man kicked at the snow near the prisoner shelter, muttering to his comrades while pointing toward the west, where trace scents from the recent storm blew, the scent of fear mixed with rising smoke in the air. The Apache woman's eyes focused on the hide shelter where the captives were kept. Her breath hitched as she spotted a small shape within, a figure wrapped tightly in animal hides, lying still. From their vantage point she could see only a sliver of the captive's form, but the size aligned unmistakably with that of a child. Her child. Her hands trembled with a mixture of relief and anguish. The presence of the child alive filled her with renewed strength, yet the dangers surrounding them pressed with equal force. The stranger noticed her reaction and shifted his gaze to the shelter. Elias followed their eyes, his heart tightening with urgency. The possibility of retrieving the child now existed, but the camp was too heavily guarded to attempt an immediate rescue. Below, the raiders formed a perimeter. Some stoked the fires while others sharpened blades or reloaded rifles. The sight of their coarse behavior stirred an old, buried rage within Elias, the kind forged in forgotten battles and tragedies he had never fully outrun. The raiders were not mere thieves. They were men who thrived on suffering and chaos, the sort who left entire families destroyed without remorse. The stranger turned his attention toward Elias and the Apache woman. His gaze held a question, a silent offering of cooperation. He pointed toward the higher cliffs, signaling the presence of a narrow path that wound behind the raider camp. It was a dangerous route, exposed to falling rocks and prone to landslides, but it offered a way to approach the hide's shelter unnoticed. The stranger's gesture implied he intended to help retrieve the child, regardless of his own risk. The Apache woman met the stranger's eyes. Her grief had carved deep hollows into her spirit, but her strength remained unwavering. She understood the peril of trusting someone she had just encountered. Yet she also understood the necessity of accepting help in a world where every hour spent hesitating could be fatal to her child. Elias watched the silent exchange between the two with a sense of inevitability. Fate had woven their paths together at a moment when standing alone could only lead to heartbreak. The stranger's presence was unexpected, but his intent felt genuine, carved from wounds similar to the Apache woman's. Whether he had lost someone to raiders or merely despised their cruelty, his alignment was clear. The three of them remained on the ledge for several minutes, studying the movements of the raiders, searching for patterns, weaknesses, and opportunities. The horse, left behind in the passage, remained out of sight, sheltered by the land's natural curves. In the valley below, the raiders moved with restless paranoia, unaware that three determined souls watched from above, united by pain and driven toward a single purpose. The afternoon sun dipped low, casting the basin in a wash of golden haze that stretched across the snow like a thin blanket of fire. The warmth did little to ease the cold tension in the air. Elias, the Apache woman, and the stranger prepared their minds for what lay ahead. The upcoming hours would decide the fate of the child, and perhaps their own lives. The stranger gestured that the moment to move was approaching. The raider camp's guards shifted positions, creating brief gaps in their defense. The narrow cliff route behind the camp awaited them, steep, treacherous, but full of possibility. The Apache woman touched the cradle board one last time before securing it behind a boulder for safekeeping. It was a silent promise to her child. She would return with them, or not at all. The shadows lengthened, pulling the world into a deeper hush. The path to danger unfolded before them. The dawn that rose after the night of fire felt unlike any the cowboy or the widowed Apache woman had ever known. The sky stretched open in soft bands of rose and pale gold, a quiet sky that seemed almost hesitant after the chaos that had shaken the desert hours before. The land still smelled of scorched mesquite and drifting ash, but now the wind moved more gently, as if the desert itself had decided to exhale. The long battle, the smoke, the shadows of painted riders, and the trembling uncertainty of the night had given way to a slow calm that carried the promise of a different future. The cowboy stood near the ridge where the last of the flames had died. His coat was streaked with soot, his hands cut from stone and thorn, and exhaustion pulled hard at every line of his posture. Yet he remained upright, steady, staring at the open horizon, not in search of danger this time, but in acknowledgement of everything the land had taken from him and everything it had forced him to become. He had fought before, many times, for cattle, for gold, for some rancher's claim. But this battle had been different. It was the first fight in years that had felt like it belonged to something larger than himself, larger than survival, larger than the dusty trail he had followed for half a lifetime. Behind him, the widowed Apache woman moved slowly along the remnants of her camp. She walked with the quiet grace that seemed to be part of her very nature, yet the sorrow of everything that had transpired lingered in the way she carried her shoulders, slightly forward, as if she were holding the weight of memory against her chest to keep it from slipping away. But mixed with that sorrow was something else now, something new and fragile, the understanding that her life was no longer bound to the ruins of her past. Last night had burned the final ties to what she had been forced to endure, and even in devastation, the desert sometimes cleared the ground for renewal. She paused near the warrior's spear, half buried in the earth where one of his attackers had fallen. For a long moment she considered it, not as a weapon but as a symbol of the chapters of her life that had finally closed. She did not pick it up. She no longer needed to. Instead, she let the wind shift a small ribbon of ash from its handle, carrying it into the rising sun. The cowboy watched her from a distance. In the early light she seemed carved from the land itself, strong, rooted, fierce yet soft in ways that startled him. When he had first found her days earlier, shivering under fading heat and trembling with the exhaustion of fear, he had not imagined she would become the center of a storm that forced him to confront his own emptiness. He had not known she would make him question the life he had lived, the choices he had made, or the loneliness he had accepted as inevitable. The world had tried to break both of them in different ways, but now, after everything, they stood in the stillness of a morning that felt like a second chance neither had expected. The woman walked toward him slowly, the sun casting long lines of gold behind her. She moved as if crossing not just the ground between them, but the last stretch of distance separating two lives that had been altered in the firelight of the night before. Though no words passed between them, none were needed, the cowboy felt something shift inside him. It was not the restless flutter of desire that had guided the men who had once pursued her. It was something steadier, something deeper, something he had thought he was incapable of feeling again. She stopped a few steps from him, her dark eyes lifting to meet his. There was a quiet acknowledgement there, not of debt or obligation, but of shared survival, the kind of recognition only two souls who had stared death in the face together could understand. She did not look away. The cowboy, who had faced down armed men, stampeding herds and dust storms that tore the land to shreds, found himself feeling strangely unsteady beneath the tenderness in her expression. The morning wind curled around them, gentle now, lifting her hair and brushing dust from his coat. In the silence, the cowboy realized that the fear she had carried, fear of being used, discarded, reduced to her body, had changed into something more resolute. She was no longer asking whether he wanted only her body. She was no longer defending herself from the bitterness of her past. She was simply standing with him, equal, unbroken. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He simply let the moment settle between them like a truth they both finally understood. As the sun climbed higher, they began to gather what little remained. The camp had been damaged, but not destroyed. There was enough left to rebuild, enough to start again. The cowboy helped her repair the lean-to shelter, anchoring fresh poles into the ground while she layered branches and hides to strengthen the frame. They worked in quiet rhythm, their movements natural, unforced. The silence between them felt comfortable now, no longer strained or uncertain. It was the silence of two people who no longer needed to question each other's intentions. When the shelter stood firm again, the widowed Apache woman paused and looked toward the trail winding between the cliffs. She knew the cowboy did not belong to her world, just as she did not belong to the towns and saloons he had wandered for so long. Yet the space between their worlds no longer felt like a barrier. Instead, it felt like a bridge neither of them had ever realized they had been searching for. The cowboy sensed her thoughts in the way her gaze lingered on the horizon. And for the first time in years he felt an unfamiliar pull, a longing not for movement or escape, but for staying, for choosing a place, a purpose, and a person, for letting a life finally mean something beyond the trail dust and the loneliness he had carried, like an old wound. The day grew warmer, the shadows shifted. A hawk circled high above, its wings stretched wide against the endless blue. The desert seemed to breathe, slow and patient. The woman sat near the newly repaired shelter, her hands resting loosely in her lap. The cowboy sat beside her, not close enough to press against her, but close enough that their shoulders shared the same heat from the sun. They watched the land together, saying nothing, simply existing in the same space. Hours passed before the cowboy finally rose and stepped toward his horse. The animal lifted its head, ears twitching, sensing a decision forming in the air. The woman watched him, her face unreadable but calm. She had expected this moment. She knew men like him, men born to the wandering trail, whose boots rarely stayed in one place long enough to grow roots. But the cowboy did not place his foot in the stirrup. Instead, he loosened the saddle straps and set the leather gently upon the ground. The horse snorted softly, puzzled, but lowered its head to graze. The woman's breath caught in a quiet, nearly invisible shift of her chest. The cowboy turned toward her once more. He walked back to where she sat, and when he lowered himself beside her again, the faintest warmth moved across her expression. Not a smile, something quieter, something deeper. A recognition that the man who had once lived only along the edges of the world had finally chosen a place to rest, chosen her camp, chosen the life the desert had carved for him, chosen her. The day faded into evening, and the sky grew streaked with amber. A soft peace settled over the land, untouched by fear, untouched by fire. The cowboy and the widowed Apache woman remained together beneath the open sky, no longer bound by the ghosts of what had happened, but by the quiet, growing certainty of what could come next. The night rose around them slowly, and for the first time since their worlds had collided, neither felt alone. And with that, their story, born of fear, fire, and fragile trust, found its ending in the soft glow of a new beginning.